everybody. I hope you're doing marvelously well. I am feeling very privileged to be sitting here with the rather wonderful Mr. Bill Schnee. How are you, my friend?
I'm very well, thank you. How are you?
I'm good. I love your backdrop. I see that you're in Mark Rubel's closet.
Yes, at Blackbird. His teaching closet at Blackbird Studio in Nashville here.
We spoke on the phone the other day about what a massive amount of work that you've done over the years. I mean, at your tender age of 27, of course, but you know, you've worked on so many incredible records. But the stuff that I picked up on from my childhood, I absolutely love. Not that I don't want to ask you about Steely Dan, but I love the fact that you work with Leo Sayer. I think that is just something that's really, really amazing to me. But I think the best thing is the story of how those songs came about is fantastic. So would you mind reminding us of that?
Maybe a lot of people, I don't know who Richard Perry is. Richard Perry was, if not certainly one of the three premier record producers in the 70s into the 80s. And I did a lot of work with Richard. I was on a little bit of a hiatus. He was a little hard to work with, and I would have to take breaks from him sometimes. It turns out that one day Gary Katz called me and said, would you like to record the next Steely Dan album? And I said, let me think about it. Yes. And, I'd love to, of course. And so he said, okay, well, he told me the facts. And I said, look, I'd like to use my favorite studio if that's okay. And he said, sure, wherever you want. And that was a little place called Producer's Workshop that was a small studio behind the mastering lab.
Oh, wow. I mean, my friend Clay Blair has that place now.
Yes, he certainly does.
Oh, amazing.
I don't know if we'll get into it, but I had quite a history there. The big direct-to-disc record that launched at Thelma Houston, I produced in that little room, which, by the way, was hysterical because when Clay got it up and running, I went over to see him and see the room. And I looked at the room, the recording room, and I went, how in the world did I put 2 drummers, 2 percussionists, 2 keyboard players, 2 guitar players, 6 horns, 6 background singers, and Thelma in there? And it just shows—
I have no idea how you did it.
it just shows, the stupidity of youth. I don't know, but if I was brought in there today and somebody said, I want you to record that there, I'd refuse. I'd say, there's no way. Anyway, Gary had told me that, by the way, it's going to be a revolving door of drummers. And I said, okay. He said, every few days we'll get a new drummer. And I said, fine. And we'll cut to Leo's thing. So from New York came Steve Gadd, who I was familiar with from 50 Ways to Leave Your Lover, Paul Simon, which had that great drag snare drum beat that just blew me away. I'm way into. I'm actually a keyboard player, but I'm a better drummer than anything. I'm kind of a jack of all, but I'm a better drummer than anything, and I'm a big fan of drums. So he came in, and we cut a couple of songs the first day, and that night I called Richard Perry and said, Richard, the Steve Gadd, and he was familiar with him, of course, as well. And I said, I just did these Steely sessions with this guy. He is incredible. And right away, Richard said, do you think I could get a session with him? And I said, oh, I don't know. We do start at 2:00. Let me ask Gary. So I called Gary Katz, who was a big fan of Richard's. And he said, well, sure. But he also knew Richard's foibles, one of which was that he likes to take 1,000 takes on a song. And he said, but you can't go over. The boys will kill me if we go over, if we have to start late. So I said, okay, I'll tell him, and I'll pull the faders if I have to, if he doesn't have it.
So this is in the same room. So you were doing a double session in the same room?
Yeah. Yeah, and I told him we have to stay in the same room because I got a drum sound that I like on him, and because Richard had his own studio, and I said, we got to do it here. The next morning, he came over with this young little British chap, who was Leo. Leo had written this song with Vinnie Poncia, who was a friend of Richard's that had written songs on the Ringo album that I did, that Richard produced. So they wrote this song, and it was one of those situations. Doesn't happen very often, but he got on the mic and on the first rundown and hit that falsetto first line, and like this, I'm pushed back, and then gadd came into the drum beat, which was another drag kind of snare thing, and like I said, it doesn't happen very often, but by the first take, I thought, we're recording a hit. There's just no way out of it. Great title, You Make Me Feel Like Dancing, and that was it. And the miracle of miracles is we got that in like about almost 2.5 hours. Absolutely unheard of for Richard to get a track that quick. He turned to me and he said, "Can we try another song?" And I said, "Richard, we've only got a half an hour, and you got to quit. You can't." And he said, "We'll quit." And so we did it. Pulled up another song, "How Much Love," which turned out to be so. "You Make Me Feel Like Dancing" was the first single off the album. "When I Need You," I think, was the second, and then "How Much Love" was the third one. So we cut 2 of the 3 singles in 3 hours, just
Amazing.
Completely miraculous with that phenomenal drummer.
That's absolutely cool. Yeah, Steve Gadd, what a drummer. I just love the idea of knowing that studio, the producer's workshop, like you say, like this little small kind of pegboard room studio. And it's doing Steely Dan during the day and then slipping in a couple of Leo Sayer hit songs in the morning. That's beautiful. It's like, if you're going to get teary-eyed about the days of just classic music, that's pretty much, that exemplifies everything that we love about it. How late would you work on the Steely Dan sessions? So I was thinking, what time would you work until at night before coming back in the morning for the Leo Sayer session?
Those sessions were, unlike from what I hear, I was very close with Jeff Porcaro, which was so interesting to me that they had this revolving door of drummers, and Jeff, who'd played on the last 2 albums, was not one of them, which I wish I had asked. I have no idea, how or why. But those sessions were, from what I heard from Michael O'Mardian, who also had played on the previous records, and Jeff, these sessions were very, very professional in the sense that we didn't stick close to a 3-hour session, but we didn't work crazy hours. We didn't work. It was basically, the equivalent, a little over 6-7 hours a day. That was it. And it was a drug-free zone during the tracking. I believe it didn't stay that way, but it was so different than I had expected. Now I'm sure in the overdubbing process, I also heard that they got kind of crazy, but boy, it was just a breeze, to be honest, a complete breeze.
I want to go back now because obviously some of the names that are catching me, you mentioned Ringo as well, but also, of course, Marvin Gaye.
In the early 70s, I worked with a couple of people on some Motown songs. I did a Rare Earth album, for instance. I was rather upset when the album came out that it said, "Special thanks, Bill Schnee." The engineer was a Motown engineer. It said "engineered by," and then in the credits, "Special thanks to Bill Schnee." And I had been told by my original mentor that credits are extremely important. They're more important than the money you make on a recording session.
Absolutely, yeah.
Because that's what's going to carry you to the next, and on and so on. So I was a little put out by that whole thing, but I kept it inside. And then Suzanne DePass, who was Barry's right-hand girl, basically ran the company to a great degree, called me in one day and said, "We're going to do a one-shot album with Marvin Gaye. It's going to be at the Oakland Coliseum," and a one-shot meaning that they rehearse in the day, and we record the gig at night. I said, "Okay, that sounds great." I said, "I just have 2 demands, if you will." I don't think I used the word demand, but the first one is that I get credit for my work. And she said, "Oh, sure, of course." And the second one was, I said, "And I want a shot at mixing it. You don't have to use my mix. He doesn't have to. If he doesn't like it, fine, but at least give me a shot." So I went up to Oakland, and they had just the best R&B band you could put together back then. It was just an astounding assemblage of musicians. They had done a rehearsal the day before, so they didn't rehearse the whole set, but I had whatever I had to get the sounds and get it together, and then go with it. I was doing the rehearsal, and Marvin came off the stage while the band did a song without the vocal, And when it finished, I went out and he was standing right there, and that's when I met him. Hi, Marvin, I'm Bill Schnee. I'm recording your gig tonight. And he goes, good, nice to meet you. Do you have any gum? And I said, at the time, I was an avid gum chewer back then. So I said, as a matter of fact, so I gave him a piece of gum. And see, the deal was Marvin had not done anything live in several years. And Suzanne told me this at our meeting. She said, we don't know how he's going to be because he hasn't done anything in a few years. His singing partner Tammy had died a few years, after she died. He went into a sulk and had come out of it now to do this. So, I could tell he was a bit nervous. When the night came and the lights went down and the stage lights went on, he went up and just smoked it, just killed it. He did a great live version of Distant Lover, and that was the single from the album. And the album did pretty well. I think it was gold. I think it ultimately went platinum. But the funny part, of course, is I did get credit, but I didn't get a chance to mix it.
Oh, so the moral of the story: ask for two things and hope to get. Maybe you'll get one.
Yeah, evidently, I never got a chance. But as the good Lord, fate, or whatever would have it, some 20 some years later, Motown is sold, and they have a special products division. And the girl in this special products division called me up and said, do you know the Marvin Gaye album you did back in the 70s? Yeah. I'd like you to remix it.
There you go. Divine intervention.
Exactly. I mean, that's what Beautiful. And it was unbelievable. I've never heard of, a successful album being remixed. I just didn't understand, but I didn't argue. And what was great was the tapes came over to my studio, and your handwriting doesn't change. Well, mine has now because we never write anymore. We live on keyboards, but your handwriting really doesn't change from, and here it was 20 whatever years later. And, look at the legend, it was all my handwriting. And then what else doesn't change is your sense of humor. So as I mentioned, we had this kick butt band and a horn section and a string section. And so there were 2 tracks of strings, and strings left, strings right, and there was an asterisk. And at the bottom of the legend, the asterisk, the key was good luck. Because there was no way those strings were going to, there was no way to, back then especially. Since on Hell Freezes Over, which I helped Elliot China record on that, they now had great lav kind of mics that's clip-ons for the, similar to the one I'm using here to speak to you. They had clip-ons that I could put on the strings so that, to get a reasonable string sound with all the noise, of the rhythm section, but didn't have it back then. But it was, and of course, Marvin had passed away by the time I remixed it, so we'll never know what he would have thought of it. But
how was it, like, bringing up those strings with all of the bleed in it? Were you able to perform some miracles with today's technology or 90s technology?
Yeah, we didn't have the technology that we have today, but so I don't know how miraculous it was, but I did the best I could on it. But I was happy because, to me at least, I beat the other mix. That's all I cared about, and I just wish I would have known if Marvin had heard it, if he would have liked it. But about a year later, the same girl from Special Products calls me up and says, Bill, there's an album that Marvin did in the 60s. I'd like you to remix it. And I went, 60s? It has to be 3-track, a 4-track or something. And she said, no, it's 24-track. So I found out the story. Let me hear about this. So they sent over the tape. What it is, or was, little known fact, is Marvin, when he started, was a big fan of the chairman of the board. He was a big fan and of Mr. Sinatra, and he loved that music, and he wanted to do an album like that early in his career. So he went in a studio in New York, and it was 3-track, and he started recording this album. And he got 7 songs into it, and he called it off, saying that he didn't feel that he had lived enough life to be able to do the lyrics in these songs justice. And they're very much Sinatra-type songs with an orchestra recorded live on stereo with he was in the center track. So then several years later, when 8-track came out, he had the 2 music tracks transferred to 8-track. They did it Dolby A, not my favorite. And he went in the studio and, had 6 tracks to play with, and he still wasn't happy with it. So then several years more down the road, he never forgot that album. Several years more down the road, they transferred the 8-track, not the 3-track, but the 8-track to a 24-track. And he went in his studio, but then he had his studio on Sunset. And he went in, and in 2 weeks, and maybe a certain amount of chemical additives, he did the vocals, and he did them more than justice. When I got the tapes and pulled them up, it was like on some of the ballads there was more noise and hum than there was signal. This was in the very early days of Pro Tools when I couldn't stand the way it sounded. But I got a friend that was in the movie business, and they had already started using it for certain aspects, to bring his rig over to my studio. And I got the original 3-track and transferred the music to him, to that, and we locked it up with the 24-track so that I could get a better, sound on the orchestra. So it worked out really well. They were forced to hire Marvin's engineer, who by that time was working as a A2 at a television studio. Can't remember which one, CBS or ABC or something. And he had the only cassette that had his rough mixes that Marvin had approved. And why that was important, as I found out when I got into the tracks, was there were tons of vocals and background vocals. And which, by the way, is the greatest part of that album is not just that he did it, but by then he had certainly developed his background singing style. And he has those kind of backgrounds on that kind of music, which you've never heard before by anyone. No one's ever done it. You had to know which vocal, and not only which vocal, but on 2 of the songs, I believe 2 or 3, 2, I think, he changed the lyrics. He wrote his own lyrics. And so he had those lyrics and the backgrounds that went with that. So I had to judiciously play that cassette back and forth and figure out exactly what we needed to do to get it the way he wanted it. The story that I can't remember the gentleman's name now, that was his engineer, told me was that when he finished the album, he was thrilled with it. He said, "This is the best thing I've ever done." And he took it to Barry and turned it in and said, "This is it. I finally finished it and I love it." And Barry listened to it and he said, you can't do that. You're Marvin Gaye. You're an R&B icon. We can't put this old jazz stuff out. And supposedly, that's one of the reasons he left the label the next year and went to CBS. I don't know. But I did hear from more than one source that Marvin said it was the best album he ever did. And
amazing.
It really is a great album. For Marvin Gaye fans, very unusual but it's called Vulnerable. They did a beautiful job. They made a special edition in a silk box. Beautiful. Which they gave to me that had a book with stories and whatnot in it. So they put some kind of promotion into it, but it never got to first base, never heard anything about it. But everyone I ever gave the CD to absolutely loved it. Ray Parker Jr. is a good friend of mine, and I knew he would love it, and I gave him one. And probably 4 years later, he calls me and says, "I just listened to that Marvin album again. Really incredible." I'm a big protector of artists and their rights. I can't stand when people, when someone dies and they take the stuff and start working it over. If they wanted it released, they would have released it. I love what Kyle Lenning, who did all of Randy Travis's albums, said. If there was something Randy wasn't happy with, he erased the vocal. He wouldn't give it to the record company. They're not going to do that to me when I die. So I get that totally. I'm totally 100%. But I went to that girl, the special products girl, and I said, I honestly believe, because there was nothing wrong with those vocals that he did in 1965, the 3-track live vocals. There was nothing wrong with them. They're perfectly in tune. And a lot of people would think they were great. They weren't bad. They just weren't. They definitely got better, 15 years later, whatever it was. Because, 15 years later, when he did all that, he had been through a terrible divorce. I mean, he knew pain. So these sad songs were the ones that were sad he was able to do. But I said to her, we really should mix them with the original vocal and offer both of them. And I went through the whole thing with her, telling her, I'm a big believer in the artist's rights and stuff, but honestly, I just can't imagine he would be upset with this. And it's such a great story. It tells the story completely. And some people would listen to it and might not notice it. I don't know, non-musical people. You would. I think anybody that's musical is going to go, oh, he was right, But anyway, there's a story about that with Miles Davis later down that we might get to.
Did they release both versions?
No, she wouldn't do it.
I wonder half the time whether those conversations go far enough. You speak to somebody and it's more effort than it's worth for them to talk to their bosses and find out whether that's a good idea. I'm sure you've been in those situations so many times. I remember working with bigger artists and one of their friends comes into the studio and says, I've been calling you for weeks. You haven't returned my call. And they're being protected by people,
Yeah.
I'm sure if somebody higher up had heard that, they'd be all over it. What a wonderful idea. Marvin Gaye, a 65 and a 1980 version of a vocal. I mean, fans would kill for that. Well, at least we know it exists now. Maybe this will shake some trees.
Well, like I said, if we get into Miles Davis later on, I'll tell you a funny one about that, similar. But the cherry on the whipped cream of this is when I had the 3-track and I was transferring it to Pro Tools, there were 7 songs, but there was an 8th leader. And, when I got to the end of transferring, what's this? And I hit play. It was Little Stevie Wonder, Fingertips.
Wow.
Not on the legend.
Wow.
So I wrote a note when I sent it back to Motown and said, by the way, there's an 8th song on here that is not Marvin Gaye. It's Little Stevie Wonder. You might want to put it where you can find it. And, I don't know if you've been through those kind of things with the libraries, that, just unbelievable what goes on. Steely Dan, they lost things, tapes that are missing, masters that are missing and stuff. It's astounding. This is their lifeblood, the record company's lifeblood.
I've got to ask, how did you get the Ringo gig? Because you ended up doing a couple of albums with Ringo. You did his first titled Ringo Starr record and then Goodnight Vienna as well. How did you get that?
Well, that was Richard Perry. The quick and dirty story of my history is, I won't go to the very beginning, but I was one of the first independent engineers in Los Angeles. My dad was a Jewish doctor, and I don't know if you know what that means, but it means that your arm is back here and you're going to be a doctor. I got tremendous pressure from my dad about doing something other than music. In fact, very sadly, when he died, my career was well off the ground. I know I had at least two or three Grammy nominations and a bunch of gold records. And he said to me, Billy, when are you going to get a real job? And I've never found the need to be on a psychiatrist's couch, but I'm sure that'll be the first chapter if I ever find myself on one. But yeah, because it's kind of a drag that your dad, my mom loved it, that, my success and all, but he never could appreciate it, sadly. I started law school to shut them up while I was learning engineering. And I got through the first semester, and I started the second semester, and I got the grades, and I'd been faking it. I had all C's and a B because I'd been faking it. There was no time to do the reading with sessions that I would book and the classroom work. So I had quit college to follow my band quite a few years earlier, for 2.5 years, chasing the LA teens. And so I decided to do the same thing now, quit for 1.5 years, see if I could get off the ground in music. If I did, great. If not, go back, get the degree, and then try again. So a year into that, it was getting close to having to sign up if I was going to join in the fall again. A friend of mine that I had worked with, one of my clients, a guy named Joel Sill, got a job at Columbia Records, kind of his dad was a major force in publishing in the 50s and 60s. And he was well into publishing, and he got some kind of a job combination, I don't know, producing, publishing, something there. And evidently, he had a talk with Clive Davis. So I'm sitting in Larrabee Studios on Larrabee in West Hollywood mixing something, and the girl buzzes in and says, "Bill, Clive Davis is on the phone for you." "Oh, yeah?" "Hello?" "Hello, Bill. Clive Davis. How are you?" "I'm fine." "Joel tells me you're a very talented musician and engineer." "Oh, thank you." He said, "What do you want to do with your life?" I said, "I think I'm going to go finish law school." "No, you don't want to finish law school. If you've got music in your blood, you know that's what you want to do." I said, "Well, I'd love to, but," and basically he took the but away and gave me a shot. And the first record I produced turned out to be a top 30 hit. And so then I had a little bit of success.
And what was the first record you produced?
It was a band called Sweat Hog, and the single was called Hallelujah. And what was great about it, well, it was good. It was a song that Joel found and gave to the band. And the drummer in that band was a guy named Bartholomew Frost, or known as Frosty. Frosty was Lee Michaels, the organ player, singer. He was Lee Michaels' drummer. So, wonderful. And he has a great beat on that song, and we brought it in. It worked. Anyway, so then with that, I went off to New York to produce Blood, Sweat, and Tears. And after David Clayton Thomas left the band, and went and cut several tracks, 4 or 5 tracks, and then we went to get the new singer to do vocals, and he couldn't be found. Turned out he was an alcoholic and was on a binge. So I came back to LA while they looked for a new singer, and I did White Trash without Edgar Winter. The singer in White Trash, Jerry LaCroix, was a Southern boy. He's passed away, unfortunately. Great, great voice. But this was a nightmare because he had written 2 songs with Edgar on the White Trash previous album, but his own writing, I didn't think the songs were very good, and the songs I got for him, he didn't like. I got the album started and it wasn't working, and so I backed out of it gracefully. And I decided when Clive gave me the shot, I had to join the union because the CBS studios were all union at that point. And they had the craziest way they ran things there. There was only one. There was probably 12 engineers, I would say, only 1 second. And that was because he didn't engineer, meaning that all the engineers would be booked as seconds. If you weren't working, they would put you on as a second. So you could be recording a major act one week, and the next week you could be an assistant on a demo. I mean, it was just the craziest thing. So when I took my break, they cut me some slack, while I was getting my feet wet. I mean, drying them off, I guess, really, about producing, waiting to see what I wanted to do next. And they threw me in on a Barbra Streisand session that Richard Perry was doing as the second engineer. After about a week, Richard asked me to take over engineering. And I've often said and asked Richard, and he doesn't know why, what made you think that I could do a better job than the guy that was doing it there? Because all I had done basically was punch in. That's, whatever. But so anyway, that was that. And that was the beginning of my association with Richard. Now, funny enough, I came out of a studio called American Recording that Richie Polodor, are you familiar with him? The best engineer, the best ears I've ever heard, and an astounding musician. I think I wrote in my book, I never thought I'd be as good as him, and I think I was right. Because I came out of Richie's studio, which was a small rock studio, and everything I did back then was rock, Richard knew about that and considered me, he knew about the Sweat Hog record and whatnot. He thought of me as a rock engineer. So after he finished Barbara's album, he went off to England to do, I think he did Harry Nilsson first and did that there. And then he did Carly Simon's No Secrets album, the You're So Vain album.
Beautiful. He
called me from England and he said, Bill, I've recorded the album here with Robin Cable, who was one of Elton John's engineers on those great sounding early albums. He said, I've done it all and mixed it with Robin, except for the 2 rock songs that I'm saving for you. And it's so funny to me because that 1973, I think that was, he and I imagine other people thought of me as a rock engineer. 10 years later, I couldn't get as much as I would love to, I couldn't get a rock gig if I tried, I'm not complaining. I've had a very, very blessed career in all genres, but I just would have loved to have done more of, rock, later stuff. Richard came back, I mixed the 2 songs, and then in his insecurity, he said, well, try a mix on this one, and then try a mix on that one. I mixed the whole album over. He liked what I did better than Robin. I did the whole album. That now showed him that hey, he can do more than rock. Whatever. Anyway, fairly quick after that, he called me up and said, I'm going to do an album with Ringo, and I want you to record it. I went, oh, great. And I know he had told me that he met Ringo when he was working with Harry Nilsson over there, because Harry and Ringo had become mates. And then he said, the cool thing is, I think George is going to participate, and maybe even more. And I went, oh, great. So we started the album. With just Ringo, and a couple of days later, George came over and came in and listened to what we had done and liked it a lot and said, here, let me overdub on this one and whatnot. And then we cut the song, the first big single, the biggest single, I guess, from that album, Photograph, which actually was a song that George had produced on him, had started in England the year before. And with his blessing, we went ahead and recut it with George in there helping. And then Richard said, almost sprung it on me, by the way, on Monday, John will be here. You mean we're going to have 3 of the Beatles on a session? And he said, yeah. And boy, was that something. Talk about nervousness. Of course, there was a lot of nerves, you can imagine, with me. I remember setting up the drums. Ringo wanted to record with Jim Keltner, 2 drummers. Wow. Which he loves doing. Still does it on his shows now, that his live shows. Well, he'll get up on the tubs with whoever he's got playing. And I remember the night before the first session, as I was miking the drums, you look over and see Ringo Starr on all the writing and everything, and it's just like, it probably wasn't the set that's on the Beatle records, but doggone, it's Ringo Starr's drums. When John came in, it was quite something, because up until that point, Ringo was the star of the show, and he's just like you imagine. He's just a happy-go-lucky guy. And then George, who is very cerebral, very, very cerebral. Nothing shot from the hip. Everything thought out and like that. And that was interesting. And so when he came on, like for Photograph, he didn't take over, but he was, Ringo, and he would talk and then John came in with his song, I'm the Greatest. And it was like all eyes were just on John. John just led the session, and we knew that everything. When we got done, we would be done when John said we were done, period. He just ran it. And it was great. And I don't know how the word about that got out. And that on that album, unfortunately, that was the only song John did. We did that at Sunset Sound, Studio 2. And the next night, there were film crews in the parking lot because they had found out that there's a Beatle reunion going. And the sad thing is, at that time, Paul had a little run-in with drugs in our country, and he was not allowed in the country. Oh! Because he would have been there, and there would have been a reunion, no doubt. So Paul and Linda wrote a song for Ringo for that album, and Richard and I went to London to record it, and we recorded it at the Apple Studios. It was another great experience.
Absolutely incredible. Did Paul work on that track with you?
Yeah. He and Linda worked it through. They had a little, not difficulty, but they weren't happy with the middle 8, and between the two of them, they worked it out, and then we got the track. And we did some flutes and certain things that week, and it was, I can't express enough how incredibly kind and sweet he was. When Richard and I arrived, we went to see him. He was doing a video. You might remember it. It was a TV special that he did, and the audience was a whole bunch of CRT TV tubes with people in it clapping. Big Barn Red?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I was right.
Yep.
I can't believe it.
From Red Rose Speedway.
Yes, that's right. You know, he invited us in, and while we watched him film it and everything, and he and Linda were just as warm and, you know, nice as you could possibly imagine. And I got to see, between watching how Lennon was, not that Lennon was, you know, he wasn't the warmest, but he was, as you've, you know, imagined, as I had, you know, just very, you know, he's very bright, extremely bright, very sardonic. But everything he said, whatever he would say, it was about music, it was just so right, just so incredibly right. And then here I got to be with Paul, who's, you know, thinking much more melodic, and, you know, and it reminds me tremendously of the pairing of Henley and Fry, you know, the little bit morose, if you will. And mm-hmm. I love Don, but, you know, Henley with the happy-go-lucky Glenn Fry. Biggest thing is that one session with three of them was the only time the three of them ever played together after they broke up. That was the largest group assemblage of Beatles that ever played together.
I'm sure everybody at this point is thinking, if Paul had been able to get into the country, what may have happened?
I know. I'm convinced it would have happened, because all of the bad blood from Linda's father and everything, whatever went on there to break up the Beatles, had died down. You know, there was minor discussions, you know, one with John, and I don't remember if it was George or Ringo, but you could tell that, you know, Paul wasn't a bad word. It wasn't a swear word anymore. So I'm pretty darn sure it would have happened. So we're in England doing the Paul song, and Ringo had called ahead when we were in America. When Paul said, "Why don't you come over and we'll record it here?" He called ahead to Apple and found out that there was a young band on Apple that was recording in their studios. And he said, "Could I please just have a week off? Could you take a week off so I could come and record a song there with Paul?" And of course, they said, "Absolutely." You know, no problem. So we worked there till the end of the week, and there was one thing left to do, which was a synth overdub, a synth solo on an ARP 2600. You remember that?
Of course. Yep.
Go Ringo. He wouldn't ask them for the one more day. He said, "No, I'm not going to ask him. We'll go to Abbey Road." So he called up, and Studio 2 was available. And and then he came to me and he said, "Oh, one piece of bad news though." "Well, what's that?" "They don't allow outside engineers." "Oh, okay." So still, I was thrilled to go see the studio, obviously. So I went to the studio, showed up at the studio, and Paul and Richard had the ARP set up up in front on the console. They introduced me to the engineer, some hack named Alan Parsons. Alan was the engineer for that overdub. And of course, I did what any self-respecting engineer or musician would do. I ran down the stairs and went into the hallowed ground of where all that great music was made. Now, I had asked Ringo for a favor when we were in England, which was, "Could you please get me a copy of British pressings of your albums, the Beatle albums?" And he said, "Of course." And so here we were the last day, and Ringo shows up about a half hour into the thing with a stack of records, Beatle records. And he comes over and sets them on the table next to the chairs where I am. He goes up and says hi to the other lads and comes back, sits down, and as they're playing, he picks them up, puts them on his lap, and starts thumbing through them, you know, and he starts telling me stories. And oh, for a pocket recorder. Just beautiful stories, one after another. And and then on Day in the Life, yeah, I remember with the pianos, the 4 grand pianos, and, you know, and it was a lot harder than you thought because, you know, da-da-da. And anyway, about 15 minutes into these stories, I looked over at him, I said, "That's really great, Ring." And I looked, and there was a tear coming down his cheek. There was a moment, folks. Because there, you know, I don't know, it'd probably been a few years since he'd been in that room where he spent hours and hours and hours. And he told me sometimes, I remember telling I don't remember the song, but, you know, he said, and we recorded it forever. And then we changed the groove and recorded forever. And he said, And finally, it was, 2 a.m. or something. He said, finally, I got off the drums and put on my coat and said, good night, walked out. He said, I think he said he did that more than once when they could get into it.
So I'm going to circle back just because I know everybody's going to ask about Steely Dan. You've got the members of the Beatles on your resume. But I think for so many of us as producers and engineers, Steely Dan is what we sort of think of as a pinnacle sonically. I'm sure you know that. I'm sure you get asked about it so often. How did you view your job? Was it your job to capture exactly what they were performing?
Yes. In a nutshell, my job, I feel that, I always felt that, I think music first and everything else, including sound and engineering second. And, period. I want to make them happy. I want to bring their songs to sound as good as they can sound. So that's how I approached it. And I was given complete freedom. They didn't, not one comment on the sound by them or Gary.
I was about to ask if Gary gave you free rein. So that's incredible. Those records sound, the word that everybody uses is timeless. It sounds like it could have been recorded yesterday. There doesn't have that sort of like, oh, I could tell what compressor or what they were using in those days. I remember actually speaking to Lanice about when some of the stuff that was done with Bernard Purdie saying that, he was allowed to move the overhead mics so they sounded the way he wanted them to sound. Did you feel like the musicians had that much freedom that they could move their own mics?
I heard a great story. I'll save the names to protect the guilty, but somebody, an engineer said that he was doing a sax solo with a guy, and the guy took the microphone and put it where he wanted it. And he came out and said, I won't play your sax if you don't play with my microphones. And, what can I say? But I've never, the only time I've ever had, it's hysterical. The only time I've ever had that happen was doing a favor for a friend, a young guy that was trying to get in to a music school. I can't remember if it was Berkeley or not, but his bass player, upright bass, the jazz kid, that he brought in was trying to get into Juilliard, and in fact did get into Juilliard, as I later found out. And I went out like I always do on an upright bass, and I listened. Can you play for me while I listen? And I move my head around and see where it sounds. And that's an instrument. I'm sure you'll agree. That's the pinnacle of an instrument that if the box is good, you can get. If you know what you're doing, you can get a great sound. If the box is bad, paper, cup, and string is about as good as any. You'll just kill yourself, and it'll never be right. But he had a pretty decent box. It wasn't terrible at all. And I listened, and I said, okay, great. And I put the mic where I thought it should be. And he said, I like the mic right here. This is a 19-year-old kid. I like the mic right here. And I went, well, but I like it here. Why don't we start here and you come in and listen, and we'll talk about it if you don't think it sounds good. And he never said peep after that. I'm not sure that the guy I was doing the favor for, who was the piano player who watched that go down, didn't tell him, will you do me a favor and shut up? I don't know. But that's the only time that's ever happened to me that I can recall, somebody moving microphones. So what happened is after Carly and then Ringo, and then Ringo too, I had found myself not producing anymore, but engineering for Richard. And, I was wonderful doing these incredible albums, lots of, phenomenal musicians and incredible albums, but I wanted to get back to producing. And so I told Richard, and of course, I said, look, you get some offerings. Why don't you, that you're not interested in, why don't you try to plug me in?
Good idea.
And he did one, which was Gary Wright.
Wow. Spooky Tooth.
Yeah, I met with Gary, and he played me the demos of what became Dreamweaver, the Dreamweaver album. And it was, as I tell the story, he said, and I think I want to record the album entirely with keyboards, including the bass. And I went, that's what I did. Really? And of course, I don't know. It just sounded completely bizarre to me. And I said, okay, yeah. And the meeting went very well. And a couple of the songs were really nice. And, he only had 4 or 5 at that time, I think, and whatnot. And but he never called back, and I didn't get to do the album. But I ended up working at Sound Labs in the other studio where he cut Dreamweaver. And I ran into him in the hallway, and he invited me in to hear what he'd been doing. And there's no arguing with, success. It was working great. And including the bass, which I was, what year was that? 75, maybe? Dreamweaver, 76?
I don't remember, but probably, yes, around that period.
Yeah, and there wasn't a lot of synth bass going on. And funny enough, he got David Foster to play it. And David says that's when he learned how to play bass with a synth, with a mini Moog, was on that album.
Oh, incredible.
Yeah. So anyway, Richard did set me up with that, but unfortunately it didn't work out. Well, a little while later, along comes something else. And this was a duo from New Jersey called Lon and Derek. They're brothers. And George Harrison had gotten their demo a year or 2 earlier and brought them to England and recorded an album with them. And they had a song that George was convinced was a smash called Sweet Music. And he made the record with them. Unfortunately, it didn't work. He was very upset with Apple and what was going, the record label at that point, because there was no excuse for that not being a hit and all that kind of stuff. But anyway, now they were coming to America and back to America and needed to be produced. And Richard said, this would be a good act for you, Bill. And I said, perfect. So let me see. So they came to town. We met with them, the 4 of us, and they were great instrumentalists. Between the 2 of them, they played everything. And so Richard started using them on whatever record we were making at the time. He started using them as extra keyboard, guitar, percussion, whatever. Richard made the deal, his production company, with A&M to make their record. Then just before we were getting ready to start pre-production, Richard came to me and said, I think I should produce it with you. And I had minimal experience, none of them good, with co-producing. And I didn't understand it. I still don't. And for me, I said, really? But basically I was screwed. I didn't have a choice because I knew that Richard and I were going to be very different than how we approach things. And started right away in booking the band because I thought these were young boys, right? 22 or something, young guys. And I thought they should, I should get some other young musicians, put them with them. Richard put them with stars. It's just a different way of looking at it, of course. But I didn't want them to get intimidated. And I just thought that, the vibe would be better, just younger and whatnot. And Richard, as I said, Richard likes to take tons of takes and this and that. And, so it was like, oh, that's a great one. Oh, just one more. Sure, one more. Richard, really, we got it 3 takes ago. So it wasn't fun. But when it really, really got bad and I had to bail, was on one of the songs that we cut it wasn't cut with a click, and he didn't like the drums. And so he said, I'm going to get Jim Keltner to come in and overdub the drums. And I said, really? It wasn't cut to a click, and which doesn't bother me. I mean, I actually like things that move. I mean, if Earth, Wind and Fire is one of my favorite bands, and they are, don't ever put a click on a lot of those great hits. So I don't mind things rushing. In fact, and fades, I thought it was great a lot of times. It's an energy that the average person isn't going to notice, and they were excited, and it'll bring you a level of excitement. So why not? But at the same time, trying to, this was kind of a groove song, and here we were, and about the 3rd hour of beating Keltner to death, right then, in my brain, I quit. And when the session was over, I said, Richard, I'm done. You finished the record. And he couldn't believe, no, you're kidding. No, Richard, it's just too frustrating for me. You should just do it your way, get an engineer and do it your way. And that's how it ended. Now, the unfortunate thing is there were no hits on the record. which is very sad because they were very talented guys. And what's even sadder is that A&M didn't give them another shot. And those were still the days when you would get a second shot and sometimes a third shot. And they didn't get a second shot. They never even got another record deal. And as I wrote in the book, this is just a terrible example of a really talented artist that unfortunately slipped through the cracks. When I was writing my book, I got online to get some dates to find out what year certain things were, because the mind doesn't remember them all, does it? And I found an interview that they did years later that really, of course, it made me feel good in one sense, bad in another, where they basically said that it was George's, after I'd worked with George on probably at that point, both Ringo albums, he said, you should go to America and work with Bill. And so it was actually his idea. And what Lon said in this interview was, I don't remember the exact quote, but it was, Bill had the feeling and Richard had the name, and we made the wrong decision. We went with the wrong one, meaning that he was saying in an interview he wished they'd stayed with me and gotten rid of Richard. But I certainly understand that they were young guys, and Richard was Richard Perry, and so. But it's very sad for them because, like I said, they were a good act.
I didn't know that much about them. I'm going to go back. I've actually just read, and we can include this down here, that they did eventually reissue the song "Sweet Music" in actually 2012. So
wow.
We'll have a look, see if we can find a link down below. That would be really good to put up. I'd love to hear what that track from there, from the original album, which was called Brother, the only album that was released on Apple. So I have to ask, after all of that, did you end up working with Richard again?
Yeah, I definitely did, but mostly, almost entirely, mixing.
Right.
I started my career back up producing with the first direct-to-disc album that I talked about, Thelma Houston and Pressure Cooker, and which was a huge success in the hi-fi market. And from there, I found a friend, an A&R man at A&M that believed in me, and I found a band. I did some demos with him, took him to this guy. His name was Kip Cohen. Took him to him. He liked what he heard, gave me a budget. I produced an album. They did a reasonable promotion on it. They made buttons with their face on it and whatever. And but it was one of those things that just didn't break through. But the next year, he called me and said, "There's another band that I think you'd be good for called Pablo Cruz, and they've done one album. They're going to be in town. Maybe we could set up a rehearsal studio and you could go see them." I said, "Sure, I'd love to." So I went to SIR on Santa Monica Boulevard, and I sat in the back of the room on, those are all set up the same, rehearsal studios. There's a stage with mics and lights and whatever, and then in the back of the room there's couch, chair, coffee table, and they had, snacks and drinks and stuff on the coffee table. I sat back there and listened to what they played me, and what they played me was like 5 or 6 grooves, no lyrics. I loved what I heard because at that time, the bass player was this wonderful Southern boy, Mississippi, I think, and he not only was a great bass player, but he was a great singer. He was one of the 2 lead singers, but he didn't sing much that day. But anyway, the grooves, and the drummer in that band was and is just phenomenal. Suffice it to say, obviously I went on to produce 3 records with them. And on the second one, I think it was, Jeff Beccaro came to hang out while I was working. And as I was finishing overdubs on one song, started the next song, and he walked up behind me as I was getting the monitor mix, and he whispered, "I like that drummer." And I went, "I do too." And that's an endorsement of endorsements. Jeff likes you. So anyway, the grooves were sensational that I heard, but there were no songs. So they at the end, finished playing, they came back around me and they said, "We just made small talk, basically." And the bass player, Bud, said, "Well, we heard you're kind of crazy, but you seem pretty normal to me. And I had my legs up on the coffee table, at which point I swung my legs around, knocked all the drinks and potato chips, everything went flying, got up and walked out. And
you're playing up to your crazy image.
I was a little wild, maybe, but manager called me the next day and said, "What did you think?" First he opened with, "You sure know how to make an exit." and I said, "Well, I'll tell you what. He said, they want to record in a month." I said, "They're not ready to record in a month." And he said, "Well," I said, "Look, I'll come up to they're from San Francisco. I said, I'll come to San Francisco and work with them a bit. And let's, get them in shape before we go into a studio." And he said, "Well, I'll run it by him." And I never heard from him again. They went in and did the second album with Val Garay. And funny enough, there were no hits on the record. And then about a year after the second album, they sent me again the demos. I guess my exit must have spoken to them. I don't know. They sent me a 7.5. A lot of your viewers might not even know what that is.
Talking about tape speed.
Tapes, yeah. That's what people used to take home. They would take home a 7-inch reel that played at 7.5 because they would have, those kind of players at home. All tape recorders played 7.5. And the first song was "What You Gonna Do?" And from the demo, I picked up the phone and I said, "I'll be right up."
Fantastic.
And I went up and we did the first album at the record plant.
It's wonderful they were given another opportunity after having an album that didn't do it.
A third opportunity.
That's amazing.
A third opportunity.
Amazing.
Yeah, I loved A&M. They were just the best label. I loved every time I was on the lot. Everyone that worked there always seemed so happy. And Glenn Johns is a good friend of mine, and I know he loved it. We share that for sure.
Perfect storm of actual music lovers running a label.
Yeah. And just the way they handled everything, it's just beautiful. Look, Warner Brothers was a very artist-friendly label too. They weren't the only ones, but they were great. Now I'm back to producing. That's 76, I think. It might have come out in 77. I guess it did. What You Gonna Do? And that took off right away, so that was good. And then, Richard called me and asked me to mix something. I don't remember it was the first thing, but I told him, I'm going to, be working on producing things, but I'll, when I can, I'll be glad to mix for you. And he called me with an album that meant a lot to him at the time and means a lot to me. It's one of my, I don't have a favorite, but this is one of them. And it's Garfunkel's Breakaway album. Beautiful bunch of songs. It was a makeout album, as Richard called it. It was a makeout album. And so I went and I did mix that one. And then what was funny, it's a makeout album, except that he had done the first album that Garfunkel did when Simon and Garfunkel broke up was an album called Angel Clare. And it was a beautiful album, but Paul Simon, evidently, as he says, told me, called him up and said, that's a wimpy album. You need that. You can have some hair on a record. It's wimpy. It's actually a very beautiful record, but Angel Clare is. But Paul wrote him a song called My Little Town, and he said, "Here's a song that'll, and it has hair all right. Nothing but the dead and dying back in my little town." And as they got together to do it for this album, they decided to do it together as they were sitting around the guitar and, rehearsing it. And they liked the way they sounded. So they decided to do it as, together. And at first Richard was upset about it because it doesn't fit in on a makeout album. All these other songs are, lots of ballads and very tender lyrics and stuff. And then comes this thing. But considering that it was the second single and a huge hit.
And a reunion.
Yeah, and that was the deal. And it was so funny because Garfunkel had decided to call the album Breakaway, which is a song on the album, like a hint at breaking away from Paul. And yet now we have a song on there that's like a reunion. So everyone was hopeful that it was going to be a reunion, which it wasn't. But that's that.
It's funny because I must interject. There's a great quote with Jimmy Webb, of course, who you've worked with, who I think is one of the great songwriters ever. And
ever.
He I can't remember where I read this quote, but it's exactly the same sentiment you were talking about for his parents, where he said he was living in a beach house in Malibu, and his parents were still saying to him, Jimmy, when are you going to get a proper job?
Funny enough that you bring him up, early on, pre-CBS, somehow I got introduced to him. And he had a little home studio. So this is 1970. He had a home studio, and I don't remember much about the studio, but I'm a car guy, and he had a AC Cobra 427 with 2 4s. I remember that very well. And I don't remember how I was introduced to him, but I worked with him just puddling around for a very little bit when the CBS offer came, and I had to leave. And I just saw Jimmy. I saw him when I mixed Angel Heart. Very good record.
So Colin Blunstone, I'm a huge fan of his from obviously the Zombies, him solo under his own name. And then for those aficionados will know that he also released She's Not There under the name Neil MacArthur.
Lovely guy. I believe he was an English major. Just, a real English gentleman, just nothing like I expected, at all. Just wonderful guy. So I produced it for Rocket, and it was a blast. Important thing about that album to me is that when people ask, what's the favorite thing you've ever done, produced, for instance. And like a lot of people, the favorite thing might be something that had no success whatsoever. And such is the case with the title track from that album, Never Even Thought, a Murray Head song that a friend of mine, Carol Childs, gave me. Thought Colin would sing the daylights out of it. James Newton Howard, who has gone on to be one of the top film composers in the world, was Elton John's second keyboard player. I met him in early 72 or 3 when he was in Melissa Manchester's band. And we became friends and stayed friends and whatnot. So by now he was working with Elton, and he was I got him to play in the rhythm section with Jeff Porcaro, whatnot. And that song, when I heard the Murray Head record, it was one of those things that doesn't always happen, where I knew exactly the record I was going to make. I knew exactly everything about it in terms of the basic arrangement, I should say, because it came out much better than I had dreamt of. And due almost entirely to James Newton Howard, who at the time, sadly, was suffering from, shall we say, chemical substances in excess. In fact, he probably hates me telling this story, but the night of the first session, I go to bed all excited because I know the next day what we're going to be doing. And at 3 a.m, I get a phone call, and I pick up the phone, hello, and it's, Bill, it's James. Everything is going to be all right. And needless to say, it wasn't all right. And in fact, that first session, I had to fire him. Oh. And he felt horrible about it and whatnot. But we made up in quite short time, and he got on, thankfully, to do that Murray Head song. And his piano playing, there's a piano, an electric piano, and his piano playing is just stunning, and matched quite equally, if not exceeded by, his string chart. So funny because I've always had trouble. I guess a lot of producers that engineer have the same problem. Things that I produce sometimes, I try too hard in the mix. I try too hard and I blow it.
It's the human condition, isn't it? We do too much work.
Exactly. And so that's the case with that one. I'd give anything to be able to remix that, and I knew it at the time, but I just couldn't. I'm sure I mixed it a couple of 3 times, but to try to get it all out, but because there's a lot of music in there. The great thing about, there's so many things about that thing that are great, but one of my favorite things was that was the hardest track we cut on the album. I mean, it took the longest amount of time. I don't remember exactly about 4 hours, I think. At the end of one of the early takes, as the fade was done, Jeff Porcaro started goofing around on the drums, doing these funny fills and stuff. He kept in meter, but he did these crazy fills. And when we got the right take, I timed him. This was almost 4 hours earlier, and it was identical time-wise. It was unbelievable sense of time, that guy. Absolutely identical. So what I did when they all left, I took those crazy drum fills and put them in a spot in the fade. And when the band convened the next day, I had them overdub their parts all through on those fills. So it sounds like it was arranged, the way it comes off, but it was all because of Jeff goofing off.
That is a beautiful record. I wonder why it didn't connect, considering how good it is.
Well, I'm sure Elton would tell you. I did another record the next year for him with produced Kiki D.
Oh,
I mean, that's a really good record, I think. We went to New York and we played it for Elton. And when the album was done, he said, "If we can't break this record, we're a bunch of ninnies." My favorite song on that one was "Stay With Me," an old hit from the 50s that Lorraine Ellison did. And I pushed her on the vocal harder than I've ever pushed an artist, because I don't like to, I watched Richard Perry do that. He was great. He would get great vocals, but boy, could he beat them up. And I don't like, so I took it. I didn't beat her up, but I pushed her and got her to, because it's all about the delivery on that song. She's pleading with her lover to stay with her. And she pleaded. I played it for, when we were in New York playing it for Elton, Jerry Ragavoy, who was co-writer, came down and he said it's the best version that's ever been done. That made us feel really good.
That's beautiful. I mean, maybe it wasn't a huge hit, just timing wise. You never know, do you?
No.
It feels like the 80s, you didn't stop working because you were mixing every other person's record. So it seems like you were mixing so many incredible records and you're producing as well.
I had a bit of a rough time. It's called a divorce. And and so that kind of, and it came right as I built my studio. It couldn't have been worse. It just couldn't have been worse. The studio had just opened, which is kind of a cute story. We built everything in the studio, including the desk, from scratch. And it was a lot of work, needless to say. And building the studio, the only reason I built a studio was to get a room with a sound, because I grew up in the 70s with all the dead boxes. But I'd been in every studio I'd been in that was older, the older ones, starting with A&R 1, with a room with a sound. And, you walk in and say 3 words, and what you hear, there's something, that's talking to you. Your voice is doing things. So I told the architect, I don't know how to get it. I'll know it when we get it. And if we don't get it, we're going to tear the insides out and do it over. And fortunately, we got very lucky and got it almost all the very first time. But the console construction slowed way down. Toby Foster, one of my mentors, was building the console. And he slowed way down on it. And so I rented a console called a Quantum. It was a little company in California that made, a guy named Howard Steele, made, nothing fancy, very simple electronics, which sounded great. And so I got this little 16 input board to test the room out. So I called Jeff Piccaro and said, the room's ready to go. Guys had come by and visited it during construction. I said, it's ready to go. When you got a time, you want to come in and do a night of rehearsal kind of thing, and I'll record it. Let me see what we got. So he brought in the Toto.
I mean, like you do, you bring in Toto.
Yeah. And I had a bottle of champagne, and we, from the time I pulled up the overhead mics and then the room mics and everything, I went, oh my gosh, we got it. And it was great. So then 2 days later, David Foster calls me and says, I've got my big break. I'm going to do Chicago. I said, oh, great. He said, I want to do it in your studio. I said, well, the studio isn't finished. He said, well, I talked to Lukather. He said that they were there and it sounded great. I said, yeah. But I mean, it's just this little 16 input console and, and it's still a construction site. The finish work isn't done and whatnot. Well, it's okay. I don't mind. I'll do it with 16 inputs. Let me think about it. Well, I thought about it and I talked to my cohorts, Jack Puig being one of them at the time. Jack said, you can do that, but if you do, you'll never finish the studio. And I said, oh, I'm not worried about that. So I let him come in. I had a booking with somebody's resurgence that didn't happen. So I had a booking so Chicago could only stay until the real booking had come in, which I had warned the producer and engineer that, my console isn't done. If you think you can do it in 16 inputs, come on. And they thought that was fine too, so they did it. But that was it. And of course, I hate it when Puig is right. But I never finished the studio. And the good part about mainly the control room. The control room was built out of concrete block and then finished off with wallboard and stuff. But the front wall, the bottom was concrete, but above the glass was 2x6s on end, which is almost as solid as concrete. And they were all exposed. They hadn't been covered up yet. Anyway, it sat like that, unfinished for probably 2 years. And as I finished because the kitchen wasn't done, and it took longer to finish things because I had to get in whenever there weren't sessions. And so there was a painter in doing something in the kitchen on a weekend, on a Sunday. And I said, and go throw a coat of paint on the walls in that control room. It wasn't my session, but I came in a couple of days later and there was a session, and by the left speaker on the front wall was Lee Sklar. About time you painted this wall. And on the right speaker was John Robinson. Are you sure about white? And those two signatures sat there because it was to be a temporary thing until I could actually skin the wall properly and all that. And those two signatures stayed there for quite a while. And then finally there was one more little signature over by the left one, and then within 5 years, it blew up. And when I sold it, it was like the most beautiful piece of pop art with the incredible musicians in the world and artists written all kinds of pictures and things all over it.
Firstly, what was the name of the studio?
So I came up with the idea. I had a strong hunch that the guys in town were going to be referring to it as my studio, as Schnee's. So I tried Schnaze and I even had a long mark over the A. And I would show it to people. I said, what do you think of this for the name of the studio? And they looked at it and went, Schnazzy. No, long mark over the A, Schnaze. Oh, yeah, it's good. But too many people said Schnazzy. Then I tried it like mayonnaise, Schnaise, but that didn't look good. Schnaze with the Z looked great. And I'm going through this, what to name it. Well, it's a construction site. And one Saturday I was in there seeing where things were at, and I got a phone call. I had the phone number already, and I got the phone number to match the address of the studio. And I got it I found all the prefixes that would work with 4166, which was the address on Lancashire. And I called them all, and would you be interested in I'll pay for it if you want to no. And finally, there was one that never answered. 2 weeks, no answer. Finally, a young girl answered. And I said, would you consider getting a new phone number if I pay for it? She said, sure. Thank you. So I had the phone number, and I got this phone call on a Saturday from a promotion company selling pens. The guy said, your new business, why don't you do some promotional pens? I said, well, to tell you the truth, I don't know what the name of the studio is. And then I went, okay, give me a small batch. And here's the address, here's the phone number, and what shall we name this studio? And those were these pens. And I was giving those out to friends and family and people and whatnot, just as a joke. But I ended up giving up and just calling it Schnee's spelled correctly. So Schnee studio.
I do like the Schnee's or the Schnazzy.
Yeah, so you know what? I did recycle that years later. I decided I was driving a yellow Porsche at the time. I went through my yellow period, which was one car, and I got the personalized plate of Schnee's, Schnaze, and I thought, you know what? If they call it Schnazzy because it's yellow and sticks out, that's fine too.
Yep.
I'd been away from Richard for a while, and this is like '79, and I'm producing Boz Scaggs, and Richard calls me, and a little backstory. I went on a holiday to Hawaii, and while there, I got a bad cold, and it was in the inner ear. Oh. And I went to the doctor there. Yeah, I went to the doctor, who turns out to be a guy named Don Aldfeld, who I had worked with in the early '70s. He was a medical doctor, but he had also written The Little Old Lady from Pasadena.
Wow.
For Jan and Dean in the 60s, and loved music. And I didn't mix it, but he did Albert Hammond's hit, It Never Rains in California. And that's when I met him. He was working in Armin Steiner's studio where I worked, and I mixed a couple of things for him. I don't remember what they were, but now it's the end of the 70s, and I'm in Hawaii, and I look up, they didn't have a proper hospital at that time, but I find out that Dr. Don has moved to Hawaii and is practicing medicine there. So I call him up and went to his house, actually, and he looked at my ear and he said, well, yeah, it's bad. He said, here, I'll give you these antibiotics, and but you can't fly home if it doesn't clear up. I went, okay. So I went and, took the antibiotics, went back to see him the day before the flight, and he said, well, good news and bad. I said, what? He said, well, the good news is you can fly. I said, what's the bad? Your eardrum is already torn. I went, what?
Oh.
What? And he said, yeah, go see an ENT as soon as you get home. So I went home. I remember when I should have figured it out. When they pressurized the plane taking off and landing, it was the most pain I've ever felt in my head. It was just in that ear. It was astounding. Went to the ENT right away. The ENT looked in there and he said, it's all good news, I think. The good news is your eardrum is not torn, actually. He said, I see what a doctor, not an ENT, might suspect was a torn eardrum, but it's not torn. He said, however, the cure for this is I have to puncture your eardrum to let the liquid out. And I went, you and who? And he said, no. And he said, it gets worse. I said, I did mention to you I make my living with my ears. He said, I know, but honestly, this is the only thing. I can give you another kind of drug that might do it, but honestly, what he gave you should have cleared it up. He said, I puncture it with makes a very precise small hole. If the liquid starts draining right away, you're in luck. If it doesn't, I put a Teflon tube in there because the eardrum is very regenerative. It's the closest thing to a lizard's tail. And it'll close right up and it won't come out. So I have to put a Teflon tube in there so it will come out. And I'm going, yeah, all right, thank you. I left, Dad for a doctor, called up the House Ear Institute, and I didn't see one of the brothers, but very famous, the first doctors to give cochlear implants to deaf people so they could sort of hear. But I saw one of the doctors there who said the exact same thing. Oh. Yep, this is it. And of course, I'm home depressed. It's over. It's over. I'll never be able to hear again. And I get a call from Richard Perry, who I hadn't talked to in probably a good year at that point. And he said, Bill, I've started a record company. And my first act is the Pointer Sisters. And I knew the Pointer Sisters. And yes, they can. Yes, they can. And he said, I really like the record I've done. I've mixed it twice. And I don't like the mixes. Will you please come? Richard, let me just stop you right now. I told him the story. I've gone to the doctor. They put a Teflon tube in my ear. I've only got one good ear. And I watched Richard, as I wrote in the book. I learned a lot from, Richard. You could learn a lot from Richard. And I did, about producing. I learned a few things not to do as well as to do, but that's still an education.
Absolutely.
But he also was the supreme ladies' man. And I would watch him say things to these women to get his way with them that were just, are you serious? You're buying this load of garbage? But he always had a way with that. So here I am, Richard, stop. I've got a Teflon tube. I've only got one ear. And he goes, Bill, I'd rather have you with one ear than anyone else with two. And so I said, all right, let me think about it. And I hung up. And it hit me. Well, why not? What have I got to lose? May as well try it. So I went in and mixed the first album, which the first Pointer Sisters album he did was a bunch of songs, other people's songs, covers of songs. And the first single was Springsteen's Fire, which was the song that launched him in that long series of hits that he had with them. And as I expected, when I took it to mastering to Doug Sachs, I told him I've been mixing with one ear. And he said, yeah, well, what's all this bass? And evidently they were a little out of phase. And so he had to roll the bass off kind of extensively, but it worked out okay. Anyway, that was the beginning of that. So then the second album he did, I think it's the second album, he did a rock album. And this, which I mixed it. I found the time between whatever I was doing to mix it. I didn't think it was a very good record, and it didn't make sense to me that they would be doing a rock record, but whatever. I got it done. Oh, that's right. I was producing Boz, and I asked Boz if I could have a couple of weeks off to go mix, and he said, fine, do it. So I mixed the record, went back to San Francisco, where we were working on his record at the time, and several days later, Richard calls me. Bill? Yeah, what is it? Can we remix the record? I said, no. Why remix it? He said, it sounds too good. I said, Richard, please. He said, Bill, have you heard the Seeger record, Hollywood Nights? I went, yeah. And my opinion, I hate putting this out to say it, I was not impressed with the recorded sound of that record. The music, on the other hand,
phenomenal,
was quite good. But I didn't think the recording was very good at all. And Richard he thought that the ugliness of that record, the way it was recorded, was fit the music. And I won't argue with that. That's a creative decision, value decision. And he said, and that's what I said to him. I said, Richard, honestly, I think, the music on that record is great, but, it's the music, not the sound, I think, that's making it. Oh, I think it's a combination. I said, well, you've got another problem. I think it was Gabe Veltri recorded his Pointer Sisters record. I said, your record is very well recorded. I can't make it sound like that. This was before Pro Tools with plugins that, like my joke goes, I spent the first 35 years of my career getting rid of distortion, doing anything to get rid of distortion. And the last 15, 17 years deciding which kind I'm going to put on this one or that one. And so I didn't, I said, I don't know how much I can do of that, honestly. And he said, well, you got to try. So I thought about it, and I didn't want to. And I asked Boz, again, and please say no. And he said, no, go do it. So I went back and did it again. I don't know how much rougher it was, but the record was a stiff in any event. So anyway, that's the funny parts of that story. Of course, the great thing is he finally figured out that this should be an R&B act, and he started and had a huge string of, top 5 records and big albums with him after that.
George Benson, we talked about on the phone briefly. I'm a huge George Benson fan, like pretty much any human being alive would be. The fact that he has this innate ability to seem to, scat sing, play what he's hearing. I feel like he's one of my favorite guitar players. He's one of my favorite singers. And the fact that he has that ability to sing and play simultaneously has always marveled me.
Yeah, it's a complete gift. It's completely natural. It just happens. It's unbelievable.
Yeah.
And, my first thoughts when I think of George are the world has never heard, as good as everything he does is, when he doesn't have red light fever exactly, but when he just sits down with a guitar and starts playing, it's astounding what comes out. And there were a couple of times the record was George Benson, Earl Klugh. I can't remember the title, but that duet album with Earl Klugh, obviously acoustic guitar player, which is when I found my favorite way of miking acoustic guitar, which was an accident, which I can tell you. But we were sitting around, between takes. If somebody had to fix something or get a sound up or something, and what he's playing is just like, are you kidding me? And then, he would settle in, and a lot of creative people do something like that, a form of that. But yeah, what a brilliant guy.
Tell us your favorite way of miking acoustic guitar.
I'm a big fan of omnidirectional mics, and I'm a big fan of the Neumann KM53, KM54, KM56, M50, all nickel for the most part. They did vary, but capsules and so on. I love the KM54 on an acoustic guitar, but if you're in a room with spill, you get it kind of close, you get the proximity. So I had a 53 and a 54 on the acoustic guitar, and I was going to pick between the two, and where they were positioned when I pulled them up, they happened to be left and right, and I went, oh my gosh. And that's become if the guitar is going to be somewhat featured, that's become my favorite way of doing it.
And where do you place them? The 53 and the 54?
Well, the 53 goes, as close as they'll take it in the hole. And then the 54, depends, I play with it, but quite often, I play with it between off the neck, up the neck a bit, usually off the butt a little bit, the bass, more the bass of the guitar.
That's interesting. So with the sound hole, you obviously get a lot of low end. Do you use the...
No, not in an Omni.
Oh, not in Omni, of course. Uh-huh.
Not in an Omni.
Very smart. Okay, now you make me think. I do have we have a KM56.
Beautiful mic.
Beautiful mic. And that is, of course, our favorite acoustic guitar mic. So it's a great tip. In Omni, on the sound hole. I think it was Al that told me he did a record with George that was the whole thing was live, with George sitting down, playing guitar, singing, and the orchestra all in one room.
Breezing.
Yeah, from Breezing.
Yeah, that was all live. And as Al will point out, and not the vocal mic he would have picked.
Yep.
That's why I learned a long time. I decided a long time ago that, music before sound. You know what I mean? Yep. It's like, could it have sounded better? Yeah. Did it make a difference? No, not a bit. It's the I will always love you story with Whitney. You want that?
Please.
One? So The Bodyguard is being filmed, and the soundtrack for The Bodyguard, for all the things that Whitney plays a big star in the movie, and it's all records, mostly David Foster records that she would lip sync for the movie. But David called me and said, they're going to be shooting the last scene, and it's a ballad, and it's the mic's going to be right up in her, the camera's going to be right up in her face, so she doesn't want to lip sync because you can't tell on the concert scenes, but in this one they're going to be doing close-ups, so she wants to do it live. So they're filming it at the Fontainebleau Hotel in Miami. So get a recording truck and meet me there on this certain date. So it's exactly what I did. I got a truck and I went there. She had a wonderful band, and that she had for some time. I was pretty familiar with them. I mixed 3 of the hits off the first album and whatnot, some others. And that I got the sound up on the band, which was cool. Everything was fine. And David showed up, and I told him, yeah, it's going to be a breeze. It sounds great. And then Whitney came. And my favorite story of that is I'm on the stage and with David when she comes in the room and comes up on the stage. And David said, "Have you two met?" And I looked at her and I said, "No, we haven't." And she said, "Sure we have, Bill. Remember the first album? And here, what do you do now?" My thought was, believe me, if I'd looked into those gorgeous eyes this close, I would remember it. I haven't forgotten, and I haven't. Yeah. And I had no choice. I'm going to look like an idiot, And I went, yeah, what do I do? And I don't even know what I did. I think I said, "Oh yeah." I mean, I had to look like a moron. Anyway, so we, as you probably know, it was Kevin Costner's idea to use Dolly's song, and Kevin, of course, was there. And the interesting thing was when I went through. The director insisted on a small mic, of course, because it's a concert scene and it would be a small mic. So I got the best sounding one I could get. I used a compeller. I don't know if you're familiar with that box, but that was one of the kinds of compressors that is extremely forgiving if you get in trouble. And I did what I did with Streisand when I took over in 1970. If I did vocals with her, which was more important back then in a way, but I put the same microphone on 2 inputs, one of them like 8 dB down. So not going to overload, because I knew, I was told it's an explosive song and so on. And so here, the girl that had sung in front of, crowds of thousands, tens of thousands, in a small, it was a banquet kind of room in the Fontainebleau Hotel, with like a crew of 40 people or something out there, the director and different people. She started on the first take and she was visibly nervous. And so, she finished and she shook it off. She said, that was terrible. Did a second take. It was better, but not good. Third take, ay, ay, ay. And then, take a little break. Took a little break. That's when Kevin, after the break, he came in the truck, and I said, "Interesting, huh?" And he said, "Yeah, she'll get it. She'll get it." And take 4 was good. Take 5 was miraculous. And the director, as directors do, let's just do one more for protection. And 5 and 6 were both absolutely gorgeous. So anyway, when we got back to LA, David said, "Would you go in and make mixes of me of all 6 of them?" And I did, and sent them to him, and he said, "Wow, it really sounds great, doesn't it?" And I said, "Yeah, everything was working just perfectly." So David got Al to do some strings on it. At the end of the session, Al left, and the second engineer finished the rough mix, and which was mostly Al's mix, but I can tell it wasn't completely Al's mix, and sent it off to Clive, and Clive flipped out. He said, "Oh, it's magnificent, David. You've done it. It's wonderful." David went on and redid, I think he redid or added some guitars, and he definitely added percussion, and got Gazowski to mix it instead of me, and sent it off to Clive. And Clive went, "Wow, it's really good, huh? Yeah, I'm going with that rough mix." And Foster went, no, Clive, no, Clive, this is a better record. This is a better record. The groove is better. The vocal on the rough mix is too loud and a little too wet. This is much better. And he said, "Really? I'm going with the rough mix." And Clive went with the rough mix. And this ties to what I said, would it have made any difference? I think it would have sounded a little better on the radio. I don't know that it would have sold one more record, but there you go.
It's beautiful. I didn't know that. And in the back of my mind, as you're telling the story, I'm thinking, I'm going home, I am going to download the movie or stream it and go to that scene just so I can hear it and know that it was live. I'm going to do that tonight. And I think half the people watching it are going to do the same thing. Now that we know, I don't know that, I don't think I knew that it was live. Thanks for sharing that. That's a really powerful story. Incredible.
Obviously I owe my career to Clive Davis. He gave me the shot.
Absolutely.
Right? I mean, I'd be a lawyer right now, probably. My mother, when I started law school, my mother said, I don't know about this, Billy. You're liable to get a ruling you don't like and cuss the judge out and get disbarred." And I have to tell you, when I hear some of the rulings sometimes on some of these cases, she wasn't too far off. I don't know. There was another one, and I'm not going to remember the single. It was one of, in the middle of her career, one of the singles, and it was when they were putting out a CD with like 4 versions, four different kinds of mixes and whatnot. And I was asked to do one of them. And those were the days when, we had to send Clive a DAT. So you left the mix up at night. You had to finish by 6 o'clock to get the DAT to him in New York in the morning. And then, he would listen to it and call you with whatever notes he had. So I did the mix, sent it to him, and he said, I think it sounds really good, but at the end of the bridge, when she goes to the modulation, she has to soar. In that New York accent of his, SOAUR or something. Soar. It's got to soar. So, and which meant to me, you want me to turn it up,
Right?
Okay. And I've had, I don't know if you want to call it a problem, but I've been caught on this twice. I can tell you the other story in a second. I've been caught on this twice with the. If it's a song that I don't think, I pay a special attention to the vocal. I'm told that I'm known for that vocal thing. And I honor vocalists and whatnot in their records and stuff. And I pay a lot of attention to it. And so it's not that I ever bury a vocal, but if they've heard the chorus twice, and it's a sing-along kind of song anyway, and when the third one comes, if the orchestra has been building and they kind of go into it just a teeny bit for a bar or two, I don't think that's necessarily so bad. But he wanted it pushed, and it wasn't a modulation. Now that I think about it, it was just a repeat of the chorus off of a bridge. So I did that and left the mix up and sent it to him, and he called the next day and said, "Perfect, send it to whoever for mastering," which I did. The single came out, the 4 versions. They sent me the CD. I put mine on. I know it was my mix. I know it was. I recognized it right away. But when it came to that chorus, that third chorus, the vocal went away, not away, but it went into the track, much lower than I had it the first time. Yeah, I don't know what in the world compressor that guy was using, and it cracked me up, because if I had had a test of that, I would have called Clive and said, "Clive, the mastering is all wrong. Listen to it." And it's obvious he didn't listen to the mastering. He let it go and he didn't give it another thought. Kind of a sad but true kind of thing.
You got some Miles Davis credits, and I don't think I can go an interview with you without talking about Miles Davis being such a massive influence for me. I saw him on the very last tour, Hammersmith Odeon, and my overriding memory of him was that the ticket said on stage at 7:30. I walked in at like 7:29, and as I was getting to my seat, he started playing. And I just remember being like, I have never been to a show where an artist goes on time. And then the other thing I remember loving was whenever anybody in the band played a solo, he had this massive card with the name of the soloist. And he would just stand at the front of the stage and hold it in front of his face the whole time that the musician was soloing. And then when they finished, he'd go and pick it down, put it down. The next person was soloing, he'd pick it up from the drum riser at the front and hold it up. I just remember thinking that it was completely honoring the music.
Somewhere in the 80s, one of the albums I did in New York, Marcus Miller was playing bass. I fell in love with this guy, the guy himself too, but his playing, beautiful, just incredible. I was just thinking the other day, it was on a subsequent trip when I'd gotten to know him. I know I've been into Porsches my whole life. That's my car of choice. And he had a Porsche when he lived in Manhattan. And he told me a great story how it was. He said he got home with his girlfriend at the time. He got home and a guy came up with a gun and said, "The keys, please." And he gave him, it was down the street from him. He went in the house and called the police and said, "My car's just been stolen," and And then he walked outside and the car was still there. He walked over and looked, and he figures that the guy didn't know that the ignition, the key on a Porsche is on the left side of the steering wheel, not the right. And he figures the guy got in the car and tried like crazy to open the door and turn the engine on and couldn't do it and got frustrated and ran. Notice to all you criminals out there that are thinking about stealing a Porsche. Anyway, Marcus did a stint of several records with the man, and I was called to mix most of, I guess, Tutu, which was the first one. And it's an album that some people think is ridiculous. How could you possibly do that to him? For those of you that don't know, it's all mechanical. Not all, but great deal of loops, programmed stuff, from this jazz icon, and, mixed metaphors doesn't begin to describe it. Other people, the reviews were hysterical because some of them were absolutely sensational and others just panned it like crazy.
I mean, I absolutely loved it, and I still do. I think, sorry to go on a tangent for a second, but Miles Davis was arguably the most innovative musician that ever lived. So if he's not embracing what was current at the time, who else would?
Yeah, totally. Miles didn't come to any of the sessions, of course, but I really loved the record. In fact, a few years later, when I was producing Boz, I asked Marcus to write a song like he had done on Tutu for Boz to write lyrics to. And he did, and we did, and it came out great. And Miles subsequently recorded on one of his albums. Anyway, the following year to Tutu, Tommy LaPuma asked me to come to Europe for the summer tour that Miles was doing and record all the shows to make a live record. And Robin Ford was on the bill with him that year on the summer tour. And so we went to Europe, and we were somewhere in France. I believe it started in France. I went to the gig, and in the afternoon, there's going to be a sound check. And Miles comes up, and Tommy introduces me to him. And the road manager comes up and says, "Miles, the equipment didn't arrive, but I've been on the phone all day, and I've got everything sussed out." And Miles turns to him and goes, "I ain't playing with no effing equipment. Rented equipment, canceled the show." And that was that. He was hopping mad. We went back, we were all in the same hotel, and I remember going up the elevator. He was still upset that, someone had screwed him up like this, whatever. I didn't have enough experiences with the man himself, unfortunately. All of that stuff that we recorded was never mixed or released.
Wow, so it's sitting somewhere ready to be mixed and released.
Until he died.
Oh, okay.
Another one of those where I think it's the family got involved and came in and mixed it. And I don't know, it ended up somewhere mixed by who knows who, and just everything wrong. Yeah, Barry Manilow. I first met Barry, I can't remember the year, but he had done the music for a movie that tanked called Thumbelina. They came to me and I mixed the single. And all I remember about meeting him, he came in my studio, and all I remember was what I remember about him from the 70s. More echo, please. More echo, please. More echo, please. And to be honest, and I've said this before, I wasn't the biggest Barry Manilow fan. I thought Mandy was a great pop hit. Clive's at it again, and so on. But I wasn't the biggest fan. But I did about somewhere 15, 20 years ago, I got called to mix a Christmas album that he did. We recorded it live on a soundstage with the orchestra, and it all went very well. He had very good arrangers and whatnot. But then what I found later, I got to hear, after the album was finished, I got to hear his demos. And darn if everything wasn't there. That's the first time I realized this guy really is a musician. He's not just a voice with, from the 70s. Because he didn't write that many hits in the beginning of his hits. People don't know that, including I Write the Songs, which Bruce Johnson of the Beach Boys wrote. And as I put in the book, Barry is as flummoxed as I am, that people think that, that's an egotist. He said that to Clive. Clive, people are going to think I'm an egotist that I wrote this. No, they'll figure it out. Well, lots of them didn't. And I Write the Songs. It's God talking, that's the inspiration for musicality and stuff. Anyway, when I heard these rough arrangement ideas and stuff, I saw, oh my gosh, everything was there. They just fleshed it out, these great arrangers. And so from there, I went on to do quite a few more records with him, and with different producers and whatnot. And it was really, every one was an incredibly pleasing experience. I can't remember which record we were mixing when he came to me and he said, I had a dream last night. And I said, oh, really? What was that? And he said, well, back up. He started his life in New York with Bette Midler as her piano player in the gay bathhouses. And in fact, she was, when he went off to become Barry Manilow, she was kind of perturbed that he left her. I don't know. That's all he ever told me. I never heard Bette's side of the story, but he said, I had this dream last night that we should work together again. So I'm going to call her. And so he called her, and he had the idea to do the Rosemary Clooney songbook. And he said, what would you think, Bette, if we worked together again and did the Rosemary Clooney songbook? And she said, I love it. Let's do it. And so they got together and worked it. A cute story about that was, you got to remember now, this is 30 years later from when she saw him almost. And, he was her piano player, playing for whatever a week. And now he's Barry Manilow. So she goes to, he had a Malibu house at that time and one in the valley, in the desert. And I'm not sure which one she went to, but the line was, she walked in, of course it's decorated ridiculously. She walked in, looked around and said, where did you get so much effing money? Because She just saw money everywhere.
Yep.
We cut that one live with the orchestra. She was in the vocal booth singing live. She redid all of her vocals, but she was there and, heard everything go down, and everything went down beautifully. Then we went to my studio to do some minor overdubs and whatnot. And then they were going off to take a break, and then they were going to do her vocals somewhere. And I remember the last thing Bette said to me when she left my studio was, when you mix it, make me sound pretty. I said, I'll do my best. They finished the album and bring it to me, and I mixed it. And she gets the record. The executive producer calls me and says, we got a problem. What's the problem? She hates the record. I said, what do you mean? She hates the arrangements, even though she sat through there while they were being done. She sat the whole time they were re-recording them. She hates her vocals. She hates the sound, and she wants someone else to mix it. And I said, really? What do we do now? He said, I'm going to work on her. Long story short, we pulled up maybe half a dozen, some lines, a few lines on half a dozen songs. They recomped. I didn't do it. They did. They recomped, maybe 6 songs. I don't know, a few lines in each one. Nothing else. Sent it back to her. Oh my God, this is the best record I've ever done. I want to be buried with it. Truth be known, she doesn't, when everyone heard this, everyone in the production process heard this, she doesn't know how close she came to being buried with her record. But it was just so incredibly funny. You got to believe it was like we all have bad hair days. Maybe she just was having a bad hair day and took it out on her album. I don't know, but it's cracked me up.
Do you feel like with artists, if there's something that they don't connect with and they dislike immensely, like the comping on her vocal, she didn't like what was chosen, they just can't hear anything being good. They can't get past it.
I think your point is extremely well taken when it's the vocal, because let's be honest. Those kind of artists like Bette, I'm sure she's listening to the vocal.
Yep.
I mean, that is what she's listening to.
Yep.
Not all artists are that way. Fagan, the first, I'll never forget, he did. Oh, another fun story for that. He came in and said, turn my vocal down. It's too loud. And I said, okay. And it wasn't loud. I said, you don't like your voice? He says, I hate it. Some people are that way, what can you say? But other artists, that's all they listen to.
Yep.
Another thing that was kind of interesting and cool on Asia was every day when they came in, they had a piano-based demo of the song. Lyrics or melodies, yeah, if they had it, but a lot of cases they didn't. But it was always piano and bass done by the two of them. And they did them to a click, and they were always great. And I'm telling you, I would say on almost half of the songs, some musician would say, they had charts that Larry Carlton did, where he had followed their demo, and they had the chart, and they're following the charts, and somebody would say, why don't you just overdub the drums on this? It feels great. No, we'll get it better. So we never tried that. 6, 8, 9 months, something like that, after Asia was out, Gary Katz called me and said, the guys are doing a song for a movie. Can you get Producers Workshop and record it? I said, great, sure. So in they came with the same basic rhythm section, this time with Keltner, who did Josie on the Asia, with Keltner playing drums. And we recorded FM, no static at all, for the movie, that big tank. And we cut the track. Everyone seemed happy. They went off and started doing their overdubs. And lo and behold, they weren't happy with the track. So guess what they did? They got Jeff Porcaro to overdub on the demo.
Oh, finally.
That's the record. So when we got done with the tracks, the last day, musicians had gone home, and I was talking to Donald and Walter, and they said, we're going to go off and do overdubs. It'll probably take, several months, but we'd really like you to mix it. And I said, guys, I don't know that I could mix with you. What do you mean? I said, well, I think we have very different styles. What does that look like? I said, well, I kind of, back then especially, I mixed, as a performance. I never mixed in edits, almost never, the way some guys did. I mixed, there was no automation, and I mixed for a performance. And I knew that they were going to want to try this, try that, try that, try this, and it would drive me nuts. Well, you'll try it, won't you? And I said, sure, of course I'll try it. So 6 months later, they brought me a song, Josie, and went into the studio, and we started, and I did what I wanted to do. And then it was, well, why don't we try this? Okay. And, why don't we try that? Okay. And it just, as I sadly feared, it just, after about 7 hours, after I had what I thought was a really good mix, I couldn't hear anymore. Now, needless to say, I had to adjust. I had to make a big adjustment to motorized faders that would help you mix. And so that was an adjustment when I installed Massenburg faders on my console in my studio in the 80s. And now I'm 100% Pro Tools, and I love it to death. I still love mixing for a performance. That's why the direct-to-disc records were always so much fun for me, is, everything right now. And obviously, for anyone that doesn't know, a direct-to-disc record is one song after another. And when you mix from tape or a computer, the guitar is going to come back with the exact same dynamics and tone, sound, everything every single time. The vocalists are going to be the exact same way it was phrased. Everything's the same. When it's live, everything is going to be different. They're playing to an arrangement usually, whatever, and it's pretty well honed, but it's not going to be identical. And you're constantly mixing and changing things to keep it together. So that's why I love that kind of mixing. So at the end of the long day, they knew I was frustrated, and I said, guys, I really wish I took the ball and said, I really wish it could work, but it's a phenomenal album, you guys. It's going to be great. And they mixed it with my good friend, Elliot Shiner, and he had mixed the previous record or two, I can't remember. This will show you what kind of person that Elliot is that I'm not. He told me that, I'm not sure if it was Asia or Gaucho, but he was mixing, and there was an automation system for newbies called NECAM. It was the first moving fader automation. And it was, with all due respect, Neve, a piece of garbage. I mean, it moved the faders, but it wasn't accurate. If you ever did moves and did it with a oscilloscope, or not even an oscilloscope, just a tone generator, and see where the level was when you moved it, and then let it do the move, and it wasn't the same. It was just, but everyone had to have it. They had to have it. So okay, so off they go, and mixing with Elliot. And Elliot said, at one point, they said, because it was literally music to their ears, pass after pass after pass, try this. So it was supposedly the same mix. Now try it like this. Now try that. Now try. So on one of them, he said, Elliot, for this pass, I want you to put your finger on this fader and don't move it. Just think about moving it. I have to tell you, I'm pretty sure if there was still analog tape and there were razor blades there, I'd be lunging for one to take myself. I mean, I just cannot imagine. And Elliot is an extremely, much, much more patient man than I am. God bless him. And obviously he does phenomenal work.
Bill, thank you ever so much. You rock, my friend. I look forward to talking to you again soon. And thank you for spending so much time with us.
Yeah, well, so do you. I think you're doing a really great job with what you're doing. I think it's just really wonderful.
Everybody have a marvelous time recording and mixing. Please leave a bunch of comments and questions below. Actually, it'd be really cool if you want to ask questions for the next interview about any particular albums or stuff like that. That might be kind of fun. So leave those down below. That would be good. We could do some audience questions. I like that.
And by then, I want to talk about what I've done since I've been here, because I've done two of the best records I've done in the last 15 years since I've been here in Nashville.
Amazing.
And they're not out yet, and I don't know when they're coming out. But But yeah. All righty.
Thanks ever so much.
Cheers, mate.
Bye-bye.